Hello everybody, this is Andrew Mitchell, and today I'd like to talk to you about my user story for the Software Engineering 1 course. As a guest user, I'd like to be able to register for the VIP project to apply for projects. Let's have a look at the release tree on Mingle that shows some of my user stories. Here's my original user story, and as we can see from here, we can look at the acceptance criteria. We originally can see that we had 3 acceptance criteria at the beginning. The user must be able to actually input all the information given by the product owner, as well as checking for authenticity of the entered information, and it must be stored in the database upon completion of the form. In addition, Mingle will also show you some related tasks that I completed during this sprint. If we actually return to the release tree now, we can actually look at these tasks on the release tree itself. In addition to this sprint's user story, I also added it to the future sprints. I use these future sprints as a baseline to continue this user story. These future sprints all contain subcategories of my main user story. It might contain a little bit additional information such as acceptance criteria in them, as well as additional tasks that I completed at a later point in time. For example, this sub-user story, as a guest user I would like to verify my email to finish registration, has a few subtasks, as well as acceptance criteria of their own. Next, we'll take a look at my documentation. Let's begin with the use case diagram. First, let's look at the guest user. They can access the registration page, and after they finish registering, it'll send an email out to an outward actor of an email system. This email will contain a link for the guest user to access the verify email page. And once they verify their email, it'll email them about their success, or if they're a staff, faculty, or PI, it'll also email the PI/co-PI. Once the email is sent, the PI/co-PI can follow the link to the PI verify page. This page will allow the PI to either verify or delete the user, and then it will send an email to the guest user to alert them of their status. Now let's look at the class diagram. Core component to my class diagram is the userCreate which has a user model attribute as well as a createUser function and an isValidRegistration function. Next we have the verification controller, which has the user model as well, but now it has a verify email function, PI verify function, and a delete user functionality. Both of these connect to the user service, where I can call multiple services that connect to our API. Some core functions include the create service, the verify email service, the node email service, as well as the PI verify and delete user services. These all connect to the user model, which we modify in our repository. The things that I mainly modify are the first name, middle name, last name, cell phone, user type, department, and email, as well as the username. In addition, I set the project to unassigned just for consistency's sake with the other members of my team. Next, let's take a look at the sequence diagram. The first sequence diagram I have shows the registration process for the guest user. Once he fills out his form, he can click the registration button, which will in turn call the save user function that reports to the registration controller. Within this controller, an isValidRegistration function is called, which reports an error if any of the information that he filled out in the form was filled out improperly, such as an incorrect email address or a name with numbers in it. If it's true, however, it'll actually create the user in the database and respond with a success, as well as email the guest user the verification URL and then cascade a success back to the guest user. Next, we'll take a look at the email verification function, which also involves the guest user. Once they click the link in the email, they can view the verification page and click the verify button, which sends the verify email function to the verification controller. The first thing this function does is get the user information from their user repository, and then it actually verifies the email by changing their user type in the database and sending back a success. Following that, it'll email the guest user updating them of their current status, and if they're not a student, it'll email the PI a verification URL to verify this user. In addition, it'll cascade another success. Next, we'll take a look at the PI verification view, which has a PI verify user button. This view is provided from the email that the PI received. This acts very similarly to the previous sequence diagram. The PI can click a verify button, calls the controller, and then it'll get information about the user, and then it'll actually verify the user in the database, returning a success, as well as emailing the guest user of their updated status, allowing them to finally log in. In addition, it'll cascade a success, alerting the PI that he successfully verified the user. Next, we have the delete functionality on the same page. It's very similar getting the user ID and cascading a success back, except in this case, if the user is already a verified user, it'll report an error to the PI. However, if they're not a verified user, it'll successfully delete them from the database and then email that user about their updated status, about their deletion from the database, and again alert the PI of the success of deleting the user. Now let's take a look at some of my code. The first piece of code that we'll look at is my userCreate controller, which has a save user function. The first thing this function does is check if the user has a valid registration. If it doesn't, it'll return to the guest user an alert of what is wrong with their registration and stop them from being able to sign up. Next, it'll create a username for the guest user that is a substring of their email address. Following that, we call the userCreate service, which when it creates the user, will send a node email to that user informing them of the link. In addition, we had a run test function that was used to just create users quickly and efficiently while we were doing some debugging. Next, we'll look at the verification controller. The first thing to point out is that the PI email that we're sending all these emails to is sajadi@cs.fiu.edu because he's currently the principal investigator of this project. Next, we'll look at the verify email function, which starts by getting a get to get some information about the user that is being verified. Next, we'll call the service userVerifyEmail, which upon success will send out emails to the PI if so required, and as well as the user to alert them of their new status, be it waiting for a PI or just being a successful student. In addition to alerting the guest user of their status by email, it'll also send emails to the PI of the project so they can verify them if they are specifically a pending PI, staff, or faculty member. Next, we'll look at the PI verify function. The first thing it does is ask the PI if they really want to verify this user as the user type that they signed up as. Next, we call a user get functionality for email purposes so we have information about the user we're verifying. Following that, we call the user service piVerify that'll actually update this user in the database as their appropriate user type. Next, we send an email to the guest user congratulating them that their registration process is now complete, as well as sending an alert to the PI saying that the user is now verified. Next up is the delete user function, which works in the same vein as the piVerify function, except in this case we delete the user instead of updating their user type. Next, we'll look at a couple of services. This one, for example, is a post to the database where we actually create the user. This one will assign all the things that the user actually put into the registration form and save it into the database. In addition, we set all these fields to null just so that we can have consistency in the database to know what fields are in the model. In addition, project was set to unassigned because that is the status of a user who has been kicked out of a project in another member's user story. Next, let us look at the verification service. In here, we actually set the user type based on what they registered as. So if they're a student, we now can set them as a student. However, for faculty, PI, and staff members, we actually need to update them as pending staff for the PI because they're not yet fully verified. Similarly, the PI verification service will look at the type of user and then change them appropriately to their corresponding user type. Finally, I'd like to talk about some improvements that we can make to these functionalities. Firstly, I don't believe it's convenient for the PI to always have to access his email and click a link to verify a user. I believe that he should have his own page with a table of all pending users that he can verify or delete on a whim. In addition, security is lacking. In the final days leading up to the end of our sprint, the previous method I had for keeping guest users out of the PI verification page stopped working. The bug involved the HTML not correctly connecting to the proper controller to check if the logged in user is a PI/co-PI. This occurred when we were fixing the sitemap, but this is definitely a bug that needs to be tended to. Thank you for watching my reference video and have a great day.